Hello, I'm R.A. Spratt, and I want to welcome people joining us this week on the Yoto podcast platform. Now, just so you know, most of the bedtime stories I tell here are standalone stories. But over the last year, we have been dipping in and out of the epic story of Odysseus, the hero from ancient Greek mythology. And this week, I'm going to be telling the second last installment of that tale. So if you can jump in right here, that'll be fine. I'm sure you'll pick it all up. But if you did want to go back to the beginning and start from the first episode, you can search back through the episodes. The first episode's called Odysseus, as told by Nanny Piggins, and it dropped on January 8th, 2025. Or you can go back and listen to any of the other episodes. You're going to find fairy tales, myths, legends, and mysteries. I hope you enjoy them all. Now let's get into it. Hello and welcome to Bedtime Stories with me, R.A. Spratt. Okay, so I'm back in my office. I did go up to Sydney and record the audiobook of Epically Good Greek Myths, which you all know about because you've heard the stories here on the podcast. But anyway, I recorded the official audiobook, which will be coming out in March. So I'm about to record this episode for you now. It's a new one. The first story from the journey of the Odyssey by Odysseus. That's what we're doing today. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do next week because I will be in Singapore next week. I'm actually leaving for Singapore tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, rather. So I probably have to record the episode in the hotel room. But if for some reason I have difficulty recording the podcast in the hotel room, then I will just have to record it when I get back. And I get back on the Wednesday. So if next week's episode, the drop is like a day late, that's why, because I've been in Singapore visiting family. That's it. I think that's all the news. Let's just get into it. And hope you enjoy this story. Okay, today's story is Odysseus and the Lotus Eaters, as told by Nanny Piggins. Nanny Piggins, Boris and the children were just finishing off their breakfast. Nanny Piggins had made pancakes, and her pancakes were particularly good. They were, of course, chocolate chip pancakes, and she had discovered that if you made the batter out of chocolate as well, then the chocolate chips blended in perfectly, and there was none of that doughiness inhibiting the pure chocolatey joy of the pancake. Of course, when you are eating a breakfast that good, conversation is impossible. You have to concentrate on the artwork in front of you. If you go and see the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, you don't stand around chatting while you look at it. Actually, you might. You might chat about where the best place to get a chocolate croissant is in the Louvre and forget about art entirely. Okay, that was a bad example. But if you are eating culinary art, you know the artwork will not be there for much longer because you're about to eat it, so you must give it your full focus. Whereas the Mona Lisa will be hanging around for hundreds more years and there's plenty of time to chat, go off and have a snack, and then come back again. Anyway, my point is, Nanny Piggins, Boris and the children didn't talk while they were eating. But as they slowed down after 8 or 9 pancakes each, then conversation did start to strike up. "What shall we do today?" asked Nanny Piggins, as she licked her knife and fork clean. "Well, you were going to tell us the story of Odysseus and the Lotus Eaters," Michael reminded her. "I was," said Nanny Piggins. "It doesn't surprise me. That is a crackingly good story." "Most of the stories from the ancient Greek story days are," said Derek. "There are so many monsters and battles." "Oh, the story of the Lotus Eaters is much better than that," said Nanny Piggins, "because it involves dessert." "It does?" asked Michael. "What, was there some sort of dessert-loving monster who terrorised the locals into making him a daily pavlova by grinding up their own children?" "Or a dessert-loving god," asked Derek, "who, after eating a chocolate chip cookie that, through terrible misfortune, didn't actually have any chocolate chips in it, then went on a revenge spree and blew up an entire city with a thunderbolt?" "No," said Nanny Piggins. "Those are very hostile thoughts." "Well, you have been telling us Greek myths for months," Samantha pointed out. "It's hard not to pick up a few ideas." "True," conceded Nanny Piggins. "No, the story of the Lotus Eaters is much more to do with the most divine substance known to man, all the gods, in the ancient story days." "Oh, I've heard about that," said Derek. "Ambrosia, nectar to the gods. It's what they used to drink up on Mount Olympus." No, I'm not talking about ambrosia," said Nanny Piggins, which was nice enough. "A lot like hot chocolate, and we all like hot chocolate. It's lovely." Especially with a nice honey sandwich, added Boris. Indeed, said Nanny Piggins. But the Lotus Eaters had found something even better. They had sticky date pudding. What? Said Derek. You're going to have to tell us the whole story, said Samantha. All right, I will, said Nanny Piggins. But first, all this talk of hot chocolate has made me thirsty for hot chocolate. Let's make some to wash our chocolate down with. So they were soon settled on the sofa in the living room with steaming mugs of hot chocolate, with marshmallows floating on top and extra chocolate sunk to the bottom, when Nanny Piggins began her tale. As you know, the story of the Odyssey began with the end of the Trojan War. Odysseus and her men had been fighting in Troy for 10 years before tricking the Trojans with a giant wooden horse and winning the war. So that was all over, and now it was time for the Greeks to head home. Odysseus and her soldiers were all from Ithaca, which is actually all the way around the far side of Greece from Troy, so they had further to sail than most of the Greek army. But for a variety of tedious administrative reasons, no doubt involving the gods, they were the last to set out. As you can imagine, after 10 years of sitting on a Turkish beach, fighting and not fighting and waiting to fight some more, with bad food, uncomfortable tents and lots of death and dying, Odysseus' soldiers were restive. What does restive mean? Asked Michael. Well, you know how you feel after you've been sitting in a maths lesson? Asked Nanny Piggins. Oh, yeah, said Michael. I feel bored out of my brain, and I feel like that if I don't wiggle something, every cell in my entire body will explode from frustration. Yes, well, imagine if you were sitting in a maths lesson for 10 years, said Nanny Piggins. Oh, gosh, that sounds awful, said Michael. Well, that's how Odysseus' soldiers felt, said Nanny Piggins. They had a lot of pent-up energy. They shoved their boats out into the Mediterranean Sea and started sailing home. But when they stopped for their first rest break and toilet stop, they had all those restive feelings bubbling away, ready to be let out. So they went cocoa bananas, guessed Derek? Exactly, said Nanny Piggins. They landed at a city called Kikanes and ran amok. Imagine hundreds of 2-year-olds who'd been kept inside because it was raining, suddenly being allowed to go out and do whatever they liked. Ugh, that sounds awful, said Samantha. It was, said Nanny Piggins. They ransacked the city, eating everything and tormenting everybody. The people of Kikanes ran off into the hills to get away from them. Odysseus was not terribly impressed with her soldiers. But after a long day of ransacking, the soldiers finally had burned off all their restive energy. So Odysseus urged them to get back on the ships so they could sail away. But again, like 2-year-olds having run around like idiots all day, the soldiers were now tuckered out and they needed a little nap. So they all lay down on the beach and went to sleep for the night. But why didn't they obey Odysseus? Asked Derek. Well, you have to understand the war was over, said Nanny Piggins, and it's hard for a great general to keep generaling when everyone knows the war is over. In their minds, the soldiers had clocked off. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were just Greeks heading home to their families after a really boring and violent 10-year holiday that they hadn't enjoyed very much. There wasn't much Odysseus could do. She couldn't put her soldiers to death because then she'd have to row all 10 ships home on her own. So she just had to sit and wait on the beach until they woke up. But while they slept, the Kikones had gone and fetched their neighbours from the village over the hill, and these neighbours were much better at fighting, and at dawn they all galloped down from the hills to get revenge. So there was another battle, said Derek. Yes, a great big fight with more stabbing and dying. So Odysseus hurried his soldiers onto their ships so they could leave. I thought Greek heroes never ran away, said Derek. No, of course not, said Nanny Piggins, but they did, sometimes, rapidly sail to a safe distance, and that is what Odysseus and her men did. Well, that was really embarrassing, said Odysseus, when they were safely out to sea. Sorry, boss, said the soldiers. The problem was the gods were embarrassed too, said Nanny Piggins. Zeus, king of the gods, had supported Odysseus in the Trojan War. He'd favoured Odysseus when she'd had her cunning plan about the wooden horse, and Zeus's good favour had helped them win the war. Now Zeus was embarrassed by their behaviour. What, because they'd ransacked a poor innocent city? Said Samantha. That's unexpectedly empathetic of Zeus. No, Zeus was embarrassed because the tough soldiers he'd been supporting had just been beaten up by a group of peaceful villagers. So Zeus turned his back on them. Now you have to understand that in the ancient Greek story days, the gods were very hands-on. If they favoured a hero, all sorts of things would go their way. Their weapons would be sharper, their strength would be stronger, and the weather would be better for them. And weather is particularly important when you're sailing a ship. Oh dear, said Derek. Exactly, said Nanny Piggins. When Zeus turned his back on Odysseus, the wind blew up and the weather became awful. They should have been able to reach their home in Ithaca in 2 days. Instead, the raging wind blew them off course. The wild waves tossed them about. It was like being trapped inside a washing machine on a heavy dirt cycle. For 10 days they suffered, being blown further and further off course. Eventually, after 10 days and nights of misery, the ships ran ashore on a distant island. They had no idea where they were. The crews scrambled out of their ships and collapsed on the sand, grateful to be on dry, non-moving land again. "Can we go in search of food?" asked Eurylochus, Odysseus' second in command. "Don't you want to rest after that awful experience?" asked Odysseus. "I do," said Eurylochus, "but I want to get home to my wife and children more. It's been 10 years since I've seen them." Now, Eurylochus' wife was Odysseus' sister, so he couldn't fault such husbandly concern, and he permitted Eurylochus to take 2 men and go in search of food, and they disappeared into the forest. But hours later, when night fell, they had not returned. Now, this was a lush tropical paradise. The forest should have been teeming with fruit and animals to hunt. It should have been easy to find food, so Odysseus was worried. But they couldn't start up a search in the night, so they had to wait. When dawn came, Eurylochus still had not returned. So Odysseus took 12 men and headed off into the forest to look for them. They soon found a path and did not follow it for long before they came to a river, and there on the banks of the river was a village. But it was a strange village. No one was working. There was no bustling activity, not even children playing. They were all just lazing about on the banks of the river, eating. "What's going on?" Odysseus worried. That's when she spotted Eurylochus and the other 2 soldiers lying amongst the natives on the grass, lazily eating. "Ho there! Eurylochus! What are you doing?" "Huh?" said Eurylochus. "Why didn't you come back to the ship?" asked Odysseus. "We've been waiting for you." "Do I know you?" asked Eurylochus. "You look familiar." "I'm Odysseus," said Odysseus. "I'm the great general whose cunning won the Trojan War. Also, you are married to my sister." "Nah, doesn't ring a bell," said Eurylochus. "You're wearing the uniform of my army," said Odysseus. Eurylochus looked down at his clothes. "Am I? Don't know how that happened." He went back to eating his food and ignored Odysseus. "What's wrong with you?" asked Odysseus. Normally, Eurylochus would have the good sense to be frightened of him, and the even more good sense to be afraid of being dobbed into his own wife. "Nothing at all," said Eurylochus. "It's just, this food is delicious. You should try some." Odysseus looked down at what Eurylochus was offering him. He was holding a large leaf with a serving of lotus fruit in the middle. "What's lotus fruit?" asked Derek. "Good question," said Nanny Piggins. "You must remember this all took place 4,000 years ago. An accurate scientific naming of plants wasn't to come for another 3,800 years. So when the ancient Greek history poems say lotus fruit, we're not entirely sure what they meant. We think of a lotus flower as being a water lily, like the type of thing you see in a Monet painting. But in Homer's poem about the Odyssey, the lotus fruit is described as being as sweet and sticky as honey and coming from a lotus tree. Now, modern scientists, being huge nerds, have spent years trying to work out exactly what a lotus tree could be in our modern terminology. And their best guess is that it was the plant called the Diospyros lotus, commonly known as the date plum. So clearly, when the ancient poem says they were eating lotus fruit, what it actually means is they were eating sticky date pudding. "They were?" said Derek. "Of course. Think about it. It was a food so good it made grown men lose their minds, forget about their homes, and want to do nothing all day except eat more. Now that sounds like an exact description of sticky date pudding to me." "Oh, it sounds like everything you make to me," said Michael. "Well, that's a very kind compliment, Michael. Thank you," said Nanny Piggins. "But remember, this was 4,000 years ago. Cake, dessert, and pudding technology was not as advanced back then. They didn't have a lot of our modern ingredients. But in that part of the world, they did have date palms. So, much like the invention of the wheel, there must have been one glorious day in history when a brilliant inventor, most likely a pig, thought up this revolutionary new invention, sticky date pudding, dripping with sweet, delicious, sticky sauce. Really, we must feel sorry for Eurylochus. It's no wonder he lost his mind after 10 years of army rations to taste something that good. The native people came forward and offered some of the lotus fruit, think sticky date pudding, to Odysseus as well, but she graciously said, "No, thank you." "Why did she say no?" asked Boris. "Because she was queen of Ithaca," said Nanny Piggins. "She had 500 soldiers and an entire nation of people she was responsible for. She couldn't quit it all to sit and eat dessert." "Poor Odysseus," said Boris. "Do not taste the fruit," Odysseus ordered her men. "Grab hold of Eurylochus and the other two and drag them back to the ships." "What?" said Eurylochus. "No!" The 3 soldiers cried out and wept and struggled, desperate to stay and keep eating their endless dessert. But the other soldiers outnumbered them and eventually were able to wrestle them back to the ships, although there was a lot of eye-gouging, wedgies and noogies given along the way as the sticky date pudding eaters desperately tried to stay. When they finally got back to the beach, Odysseus cried out to the other soldiers, "Quick! Men, get back in the ships! There is an enemy on this island more dangerous than any Trojan soldier or mythical beast. There is a dessert so good it makes a man lose his mind." "Oh, I fancy a spot of dessert," said one of the soldiers. "Just get back on the ship before I get cross," snapped Odysseus. Eurylochus and the other 2 were still struggling and crying out. "Tie them to their benches," ordered Odysseus, "and do not release them until we're so far out at sea we can no longer see land, because if they could see it, they'd just leap into the water and try to swim back to eat more dessert." And so they sailed away, and Odysseus realized she had suffered a close call. Zeus was against them now, and would try to prevent their return home using every devious way he could imagine, if he was prepared to stoop so low as to involve the sweet innocence of a delicious dessert. The end. Time for bed. "It's 9:30 in the morning," said Samantha. "Oh, so it is," said Nanny Piggins. "Hey, isn't it Tuesday? Shouldn't you be at school?" She noticed that the children were wearing their school uniforms. "Well, we've missed the first half hour now," said Derek. "Oh, well, then there's no point in you going," said Nanny Piggins. "Besides, I've got a much more educational idea. Let's make sticky date pudding!" "But you just told us a story about how mind-alteringly good sticky date pudding is," said Samantha. "Well, do you have to sail to Ithaca today?" asked Nanny Piggins. "No," said Samantha. "Then there's no reason why you can't lie around eating lotus fruit/sticky date pudding, is there?" The children could think of no argument to that, mainly because they didn't want to, so they all rushed to the kitchen to get started. The end. All right, well, there you go. That's the story for this week. We'll see what happens next week, whether I get to record one while I'm in Singapore or you might have to wait an extra day for next week's episode. We'll see. But I do have an idea in mind. I'm going to keep doing all the stories from the Odyssey, all about the things that happened to Odysseus on his journey back to Ithaca. And there's lots of really cool stories. The next one is the story of the Cyclops, which is extra especially cool. But I'm not going to try and do that when I'm in Singapore because that's a big, full-on story. Really cool. So I was going to do a shorter one next week. Someone requested that I do some Irish folk tales. So I've been looking up Irish folk tales, and there's one that there's lots that are great, but one that really struck my fancy is a tale called The Salmon of Knowledge, like salmon as in fish, and it's got some nice details in that story. So that's probably a bit shorter, so I'll be doing that. That's the one I'm going to be attempting to do when I'm in Singapore. All right. Okay, that's it for now. Until next time, goodbye. Hello, it's me again. If you enjoyed listening to Bedtime Stories with R.A. Spratt, it would be really helpful if you could like, subscribe, follow, and or review the show on whatever podcast platform you're listening to now. Every little one of those digital affirmations helps, and the bigger this podcast gets, the more I can justify procrastinating from my real job to keep bringing these stories to you. Thank you.